Teach me about the Great Lakes. Teach me about the Great Lakes. Welcome back to Teach Me About the Great Lakes, a twice-monthly podcast in which I, a Great Lakes novice, ask people who are smarter and harder working than I am to teach me all about the Great Lakes. My name is Stuart Carlton, and I know a lot, I think, about maybe getting the settings on the soundboard right so that I don't sound like a hyper-compressed, stupid FM DJ. But I don't know a lot about the Great Lakes, and that's the point of this here show. And I'm joined today by the lake lover herself, Megan Gunn. Megan.
It's going really well. I mean, the weather is weird.
It's a brave new world.
Yes, it is.
Sure is.
I mean, and climate change is real. I don't understand.
I was just talking about this. I just got a paper accepted looking at risk perceptions related to genetically modified salmon.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And I was trying to explain it to my family, and it's looking at, some of the comparing people's attitudes towards risk perceptions related to genetically modified foods to their risk perceptions related to climate change, because these are both things where there's a scientific consensus one way, but many people believe another way. So Anyway, we'll talk about that in some other episode. We don't have time because today we have a very special guest, so we will just go straight to it. But good news, he's a researcher. So you know what that means.
My favorite feature.
There it is. Researcher feature, a feature in which a researcher gonna teach us about the Great Lakes. I'll let that fade. Our guest today is Dr. Drew Gronewold. He's an associate professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability. The University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I call it C's.
I call it
C's. And he does all kind of stuff looking at, I think, runoff and water quality and water quality dynamics. And so we're going to talk about all of that and maybe get a little nerdy on Bayesian statistics, but maybe not, because I'm not actually smart enough for Bayesian statistics. So we'll see precisely how nerdy. You know what you can do? I want you to right now create a prior distribution for how nerdy you think we're going to get, and you can update that by the end of this episode. So it'll be really good. Drew, how are things over in Ann Arbor?
They're great, and you've livened up my day by providing a beautiful description of prior distributions and Bayesian statistics. It's a frequent subject of discussion in my household, so we're doing
there
great
we go.
today. Thank you.
Yeah, sounds great in your house in a certain specific way. So you look at runoff in ungaged basins is what your little bio says, and of course I've done a lot of research into that. What is it? First of all, what is an ungaged basin? And let's even start with the basics of the basics. So what kind of systems do you work in?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work. That snippet from my website is definitely one aspect of what we do and the research we have done. But if we want to talk specifically about gauged and ungaged basins, it's probably first to start off by talking just what the heck do we mean by a gauged anything, whether it's gauged land surface or a gauged water level or a gauged basin. So when we're talking about gauging, we're talking about measuring water flow. And I need to take a moment to just articulate how lucky we are, at least within the United States, to have agencies like the United States Geological Survey that as part of their foundational services to the country, they install and maintain these gauges, whether they're measuring rainfall or temperature, or in this case, what we're talking about, flow in rivers and streams. They do that as part of their service. Now, these gauges can't be put everywhere across the entire country. They can't measure every stream, and they can't measure everywhere along every stream. So if you look across the entire country and entire continent, every river and stream has its own little watershed, and you put the watersheds together and you can have a much larger basin. The basin is really, for this conversation, like a large watershed. And so if you were to put a gauge in the middle of a stream to measure flow, you would really only be measuring the flow coming from all of the land area that is upstream of that gauge. So if you put on a map all of the gauges that we have across this country for measuring flow, there are going to be areas of the country that are quote unquote gauged. In other words, where we're measuring the flow from the watershed through the stream. And then, of course, there are going to be a lot of areas that are ungauged. And so one long-standing area of water science research has been trying to estimate, without the use of a gauge, how much water is flowing through a stream below or downstream of an area where the United States Geological Survey or someone else maintains one of these gauges. So it's a really important area of research, and it is definitely something that we and hundreds of other hydrologists have been working on for decades.
Got it. No, that makes sense. So yeah, let me first of all echo your appreciation for the USGS and the work they do. Honestly, if I had to pick a number one theme over the nearly 5 years we've been doing this show, it's the importance of these longstanding government data sets, right? Because if they don't collect it, it's probably not going to get collected. That doesn't mean that they collect everything. And so what you're doing then is are you using like some sort of modeling process, I guess, statistics or something? Do you gather some data and then try to model what else is there to fill in? So we have these sort of, it's like Swiss cheese, right? Like Sam's memory in, what was that? Quantum Leap, right? And so you try to fill in the holes in that Swiss cheese, I guess, using statistical and other techniques. Is that a fair way to put it?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. So there are a range of mathematical and modeling techniques that you could use to sort of, I would say, let's say, translate information about how water is flowing in one part of the basin where there is a gauge into an area where there is not a gauge. One of the easiest ways, in fact, one of the simplest ways, is to just simply calculate how much runoff you get or what the flow is at a gauge for a certain watershed area. And you could start off with the assumption that, hey, maybe the area of a watershed that doesn't have a gauge has the same characteristics, the same soil type, the same slope, the same rainfall distribution, where that flow per unit area might be actually pretty similar to the flow per unit area downstream of the gauge. And if that assumption is correct, the only thing you need to know about the downstream area is its area, and then you can calculate the flow. But as you can imagine, if you look at watersheds, whether it's in the Great Lakes or elsewhere, as you go downstream through a watershed, a lot of things change. In some areas of the country, the upper portions of the watershed have mountains and a lot of snow, steep gradients, and a different soil type. And as you get closer and closer to a large lake or the ocean, things tend to flatten out a little bit. Maybe the soils are more porous, maybe more saturated. And so there are areas where the relationship between runoff and area doesn't stay consistent throughout a watershed or a basin. And that's the case where we might use more sophisticated computer models that are representing things like the physical properties of the soil and the relationship between how water flows through that soil and across the different land surfaces. So a range of different techniques. And there are a lot of hydrologists and scientists who have quite literally made their careers out of studying these different techniques. And it's one element of what we're doing right now in our research on the Great Lakes.
I mean, it's a much fancier way than I used to use it. So I used the Indiana USGS gauge for many, many years when I was a researcher. Prior to my environmental education hat, I managed an aquatic ecology research lab. And we went up and down the Wabash River, and for safety purposes, we'll look at the USGS gauge to make sure that we were going on the river and that flow was proper, so that we didn't get drifted away by driftwood or knocked out by driftwood or anything like that. But doing exactly what you talked about, where we had to look at some of those gauges that were much higher upstream than where we were going to, because that information just didn't exist. So much less sophisticated than the research that you
it was quite some
very cool.
That was
all right. So then you kindly were going to move us into the Great Lakes. I actually was about to take us off on a place we don't even need to go. So we will instead follow your lead, Drew, and say, so that's part of the research that you're doing in the Great Lakes. So explain to us how that fits into your larger Great Lakes research program and what we're learning about the Great Lakes as a result, please.
Sure. So we have a lot of projects going on right now. The research group that I'm very fortunate to work with undergraduate students, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and colleagues. But the big thing we have going on right now is our Global Center for Understanding Climate Change Impacts on Transboundary Waters. And it's kind of a long name there, but the key points in there are climate change impacts and transboundary waters. And one of our initial focal points for this global center is the Great Lakes. And one of the things that the members on the team in this global center have expertise on is understanding how to measure, monitor, predict, and understand the history of water that flows through and across multiple sovereign nations, not just the United States and Canada, but the lands of our tribes in the United States and First Nations across the Canadian land surface. So when we talk about things like using the USGS to understand flow in the United States, our global center is trying to understand how do you put together different forms of knowledge, some of which have been written, some of which are spoken, some of which are based on infrastructure of the federal government, and put it all together to understand the quantity and quality of water. And this is not an easy thing to do. There are not many places in the world where you have massive, massive lakes where different countries and different sovereign nations use that water and have to come together and talk to develop an understanding of how that water is changing, especially as the climate is changing around it. So I'll finish off by saying in the Global Center, we have several research themes. In fact, we have 3 primary research themes. One of those is what we call hydroclimate. It's basically understanding the hydrology and the climate of the Great Lakes, both in the past and the projections for the future.
Can we take a step back? Thank you. This is fantastic information. But what is a transboundary water? Because I'm sure I am not the only person that will be listening that's like, got climate change and impacts, but the transboundary waters is.
Yeah, we would define it as any water body, like a river or lake, or any watershed that crosses the boundaries of multiple nations, right? So the Great Lakes are actually a wonderful example. The U.S.-Canada border runs right down the middle of Lake Superior, right through the middle of Lake Huron, right down the middle of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. So it is one of the best examples in the world of a massive transboundary water system. But all the other watersheds along the U.S.-Canada border, all the way through the Columbia River up to the Yukon, they are all transboundary or transnational watersheds. And as a result, they all require harmonization and communication from the multiple nations across which those waters intersect. So hopefully that helps provide a little more clarity on that term.
Yes. And so I guess my next question is, within these 3 dynamic research clusters that you have, which area does your research focus in, or do you work across these different clusters?
I work across these different clusters, so I'm very fortunate to, I'm one of the lead PIs on the project, along with my colleague, Gail Kranzberg from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. And the way the Global Center is set up, these 3 research clusters or themes include the hydroclimate cluster theme that I just talked about. And the 2 other clusters are ecosystem function and water quality. And that's something where I've also done quite a bit of work in as well. And then there's a 3rd cluster that's called community resilience and transboundary governance. And so the idea is that every single member, whether it's a student or a postdoctorate fellow, or even one of the lead principal investigators in the center, works on a project that in some cases falls squarely within one of those clusters. But really the idea is for us to do developing and pursuing projects that cut across these clusters and incorporate all the 3 themes. The final point I would make is one of the most important things that we're trying to do is develop hydroclimate information that is useful for people or plants and animals that need that information, either from a water quality and ecosystem perspective, or to help communities be more resilient to changes in the climate in the Great Lakes.
So then a key challenge for you thinking about this is my research tends to be small and because I don't work well with others. But I was part of a large project back when I was a postdoc, actually, with a woman named Linda Prokopi, who was my mentor and friend, working on taking climate information and trying to make it usable by farmers across the Midwest. And there were many people, actually several people at the University of Michigan were involved in that too. And so a big challenge was finding the right level of information that people actually needed. Because we had people who were doing climate modeling and who were generating computerized decision support tools and things like that. And they wanted to do stuff that was up here, and the farmers wanted to do stuff that was much more on the ground and localized, right? So what are y'all doing to try to, do you notice that that sort of discrepancy or that challenge? Is that something y'all are coming across? How are y'all managing that?
100%. That is that you just articulated. I need to say no more. Because you just articulated exactly the type of representative relationship that we're looking to find but I'll broaden out a little bit since we're doing a conversation here. What we as a center are trying to do is understand how do different communities across the Great Lakes, with a broad definition of different types of communities, how are they accessing, maybe they're not accessing it at all, how are they accessing climate data, where are they getting it from, how are they using it, and to what extent does it actually change decisions they make about where they live, how they move around the Great Lakes Basin. And so that area of research falls primarily within that community resilience and transboundary governance cluster. So one of the lead researchers in that cluster is my colleague, Carolyn Johns from Toronto Metropolitan University, and also Richard Norton or Dick Norton from here at the University of Michigan. They are experts in understanding how communities make decisions in light of climate information. We're trying to broaden that to understand where are communities actually looking for climate information. And actually, since we're talking a little about things like USGS and NOAA, I actually worked for NOAA for about 10 years. And NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers, Environment Climate Change Canada on the Canadian side do an amazing job of generating models and data sets. But both the federal agencies and scientists like us at universities aren't entirely sure about just how effectively that information is making it into the hands of different users. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to understand so that the information can be generated and communicated in a way that's more effective.
That is interesting. And now I'm going to go the other way, though, because, the one thing we learned with the useful to use, well, not the one thing, one of the things we learned, hopefully for whatever $5 million we learned, maybe three things. But the one thing we learned was, one of the things we learned is the gap between, what's cutting edge in terms of science and what the end users need. But then, and so a lesson I took from that was, let's not get too fancy and overthink it. But I think on the flip side, though, by enabling that research that's more cutting edge and having the people who are doing it at least start to think about end users, what you're doing is setting up 4 moves down the line, right? Where in some number of years, the stuff that is currently cutting edge will be really useful, even if it's not currently useful to decision makers because it's too far out there. It very well, you're creating the next generation of useful information, I think, as part of what you're doing.
We hope so. Yeah.
So I don't. You have to run that. It's like you want to be practical, but you also want to be future proofing yourself, I guess. Yeah. So it's a lot of management, and if you're directing this, your job has changed, right, from researcher to people manager, I think, for better or worse. And so, all right. So we have that, and it's doing really important work across boundaries. And I want to point out that you mentioned we have tribal boundaries as well in there that haven't been traditionally recognized, and I think that's really important to engage in those communities. And you, I think, alluded to multiple ways of knowing, which probably includes traditional ecological and indigenous knowledge in there too, which is so important. And so thinking about all the different groups you have working, is there any sort of lesson that you have about, what have you learned, I guess, from bringing all these groups together so far? It can be like process oriented, or it can be about the Great Lakes specifically, just one kind of interim lesson, I guess.
Yeah, what a great question. And I do want to mention, even though I initially launched into this, this is about the Great Lakes, I do want to mention they're doing work elsewhere in the continent and around the world. One of our other really important projects that's being led by some of our colleagues in Canada and also one of our PhD students, Vianney Rueda, is on the U.S.-Mexico Treaty and management of the Rio Grande. So we're doing work all across the continent. And so some of the lessons learned that I'm talking about reflect not just our work on the Great Lakes, but across the continent and elsewhere around the world. And really, one of the take-home messages is the importance of thinking really hard about when you put the initial team together and who you'd like to work with. If you looked at the website for the Global Center, you'd see a cast of characters, some of whom have made their entire careers about working in transboundary governance within the Great Lakes and elsewhere. But every single one of those individuals brings something amazing to the Global Center. And they also, I think for the most part, enjoy working together and come up with amazing ideas. And so the take-home message here is that the initial team building is critical. And I also want to touch on your point about, distinguishing the term between engagement and initial team development. every single member of the team right now, whether it's from 6 nations of the Grand River or the Red Lake Nation Band of Chippewa or the College of Menominee Nation, or either our colleagues at Cornell or Wisconsin-Madison or Brock University, they were all part of the initial proposal to the primary funding agencies. In other words, it wasn't about getting an award and then reaching out for engagement, which is kind of common. Everyone was part of this from the get-go before we even got funded. And that has had, I think, a really positive impact on our moving together as a team.
One other point, I've been only half listening, because I spent the last 45 minutes trying to remember the name of a book that I'm reading. So, see, because I'm a member, not only am I a researcher, but I'm a member of the media now. And so people send me stuff. And so somebody sent me a book that I'm reading called The Lives of Lake Ontario. Okay. And one of the things that a guy named Daniel McFarlane, who is a associate professor at Western Michigan University, he wrote this book. It's pretty interesting. But something just blew my mind on the very first page, second page, whatever. And this is the idea that, like, really what lakes are, this isn't exactly a phrase, but this is how I've thought of my mind, is what lakes are essentially the ramifications of like an indentation in the ground, right? Lakes in some ways are defined by what is underneath them. And it's a collection of, especially in the Great Lakes where the turnover is so low, right? And that got me thinking about all these different definitions of what lakes are. And in some ways, you're doing the scientific equivalent of that, right? Is like everybody's got these different perspectives and different definitions of what even is there. And bringing all of them together, I think, to have these conversations and doing it from the get-go is a very powerful way to do work. And so I think that's great.
Yeah, Dan is great. I know Dan well. I've been to WU and met with him and have many of his books. The Lives of Lake Ontario came out relatively recently. Yes, is that? Yes,
just the last couple of months. I got it before it was released, but I think the public can buy it now.
Yeah, well, wonderful. I'll put a shout out for Daniel. Some of the books that he has written about the IJC, about the International Joint Commission, and really the history of some of the transboundary work in the Great Lakes is really fantastic. So great shout out.
We'll have to get him on at some point.
Drew, could you tell us about a few key partners at the center that might not be as well known as the big universities?
I guess a couple. I mean, if we're talking about the Great Lakes and we're talking about work that's done to help, scientific research that's done to help understand the Great Lakes, both in the past and the future, part of what I want to do is make sure I talk about the Global Center and the partners that we have. One of the partners that I need to acknowledge that is so critical to all of this, in addition to National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the Army Corps of Engineers, I guess there's 2 things I'm going to mention. And one of the groups that's critical to this, and I'm sure, Stuart, you know this group, and Megan, maybe you do too, is the Cooperative Institute for Great Lakes Research. Are you guys familiar with SIGLR? It used to be called CIRI, yes. Now it's SIGLR. But it's important for the public to understand just how important it is to have this institute that works jointly between the federal government, that is amazing at doing things like data and models and big computers, but doesn't always have the opportunity to hire students and work nimbly in an academic environment. Then you have the academic environment where people are constantly grappling for grants every 2 to 3 years and have to shift from project one to another. The fact that we have this cooperative institute that sits in the middle of those 2 worlds and is able to both tap into these foundational data sets and models for the Great Lakes, while at the same time nimbly hiring students and scientists to keep papers going and research generated for the public, is really an amazing thing. And so the fact that we have a partnership both through SEAS and through the Global Center with SIGLR is it's game changing. And it's a wonderful aspect of working here at the University of Michigan. In that same breath, can I mention one other thing that's happening right now that I think the readers
you can, but before you do, we should send our listeners to teachmeaboutthe.greatlakes.com/91, because as Megan surely remembers, we had a nice conversation with Mike Schreiberg, Associate Director and Director of Engagement.
There's actually a really cool thing going on right now in Ann Arbor, but it doesn't always happen in Ann Arbor. And so when we talk about data sets that people rely on to make decisions that are generated by the federal government across the entire Great Lakes Basin, believe it or not, there is a group, and get ready for a long name here. It is called the Coordinating Committee on Great Lakes Basic Hydraulic and Hydrologic Data. The acronym is terrible, The name is long.
What's that acronym?
But here's the deal. This group started getting together in the early 1950s between people from Canada and the United States on an ad hoc basis every 6 months to sit down and coordinate all of the data about the hydraulics and the hydrology of the Great Lakes system. They come together and they spend 2 days. They used to do just the water level data to make sure the United States and the Canadian water level data matched up. But now they go through evaporation, precipitation, runoff. They generate models and compare them. They look at the flow in the channels between the Great Lakes. And they're actively doing that right now at the NOAA Great Lakes Research Laboratory in Ann Arbor. 6 months from now, they'll do it again. And then a year from now, they'll do it again. Every 6 months, this group gets together, totally under the radar, to make sure that the data about the Great Lakes that we all use is accurate. And I just think that's amazing. That's something the public should be more aware of.
Yeah.
That
is awesome. The
yeah.
That is wonderful. Well, Drew, it's been really interesting to hear about it. And we could just go for hours and hours, but we're trying to keep our episodes shorter because they were going too long. And so we're trying to keep them shorter, but we'll have to get back in touch in a year or two to get an update from you. But in the interim, that's actually not why we invited you here to teach me about the Great Lakes this week. The reason, as everybody knows, that we invited you on teaching me about the Great Lakes is it's 2 questions. The first one is this. You could have a great donut for breakfast or a great sandwich for lunch. Which one would you have?
Well, I don't know if that's like either or, Justin, a donut or a sandwich. I would go with the donut. And in fact, there is a place in downtown Saline, Michigan called Benny's, and they make awesome donuts. Bennys, right in downtown Saline. And their peanut donut is off the charts. So peanut donut
there it is.
Downtown Saline Benny's. There it is.
Look at that. There it is. No, I'm fired up. And we managed to get through an Ann Arbor guest without them saying Zingerman, so that's good.
I thought about it, but too cliche. We're going Benny's.
Yeah, no, we're good. Zingerman's is represented. Zingerman's is represented. Well, thank you. Where is Saline, Michigan? Let's pretend that I don't know where that is.
Southwest of Ann Arbor, just down the road, not far away at all.
So in between Detroit and Ann Arbor somewhere. All right.
Southwest of Ann Arbor, heading out of town.
I don't know Michigan geography. You got to hold up the hand. That's fine. It's all fine.
Southwest is in Michigan geography, but we'll roll with
it. Well, what I would like to know is there a special place in the Great Lakes that you'd like to share with our audience? And what makes it special?
Yeah, what a great question. I mean, I think all of us know that there are a lot of great places in the Great Lakes, and they all mean different things to different people, from urban environments to rural environments to remote places. I think the one that really stands out to me is, I've spent a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula. I've been to Isle Royale, but when you stand on the shoreline of Lake Superior, especially along like Lake Superior State Park on the southern shoreline, it's a little bit daunting. So that's one of my favorite places. And the reason why is when you dip your toe into that water, you're dipping your toe into a body of water that is the largest freshwater surface on the planet, period. Like nothing else even comes close. So when you're dipping your toe into that water goes forever. And I'm sometimes even curious about how many people even know that. And then I even think even further, like hundreds of years ago, people probably didn't know that. I'm curious to what extent they sort of felt the gravity or the magnitude of the lake, whether they know that or not. So anyway, southern shoreline of Lake Superior, looking out over the lake, just an amazing experience.
I can't think of a better place to leave it than that. Dr. Drew Gronewold, the associate professor in Seas at the University of Michigan, which, as we all know, is to the west of Detroit.
Yes.
Thank you so much for coming on and teaching us all about the Great Lakes.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Teaching About the Great Lakes is brought to you by the fine people at Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. We encourage you to check out all the cool stuff we do at iicgrant.org and at ILINC Grant on Facebook, Instagram, and other social medias.
All of them. Well, except some. We'll be on Blue Skies. Just actually, listen up. Just stay off social media. It's fine. You'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
But if you're on it, you might as well check out the cool work that we do. Our senior producer is Carolyn Foley, and Teach Me About the Great Lakes is produced by Megan Gunn and Renie Miles. Ethan Chitty is our associate producer and our fixer. Our super fun podcast artwork is by Joel Davenport. Most of the music in here is by me, and so sorry about that. The show is edited by the patient, increasingly less patient, Sandra, her professional Sandra Svoboda.
If you have any questions or comments about the show, please email it to teachmeaboutthegreatlakes@gmail.com or leave a message on our hotline at 765-496-4474. And we will keep asking you all to call us and email us until you do.
That's right.
Thanks for listening, and keep creating those links.